Thanks for joining us at Right On Replicas, where we're proud to bring you the best scale model kit reviews on the planet. This review covers the Italeri 1/72nd scale XB-70 Valkyrie kit. It's kit number 1282, and it was originally produced by AMT back in the 90s, but the molds were sold to Italeri back in '07. And they reissued it with a nice new box art and great cartograph decals. It's still in production, and you can find them on the Italeri website. Now, the model comes on 7 sprues with only 66 parts. It's molded in gray and 1 sprue of clear parts with 2 canopy options. Once again, it has the nice decal set, and it was made by Cartograph of Italy, and the finished model, when you're done, is 31.5 inches long and 18 inches wide, so it's going to take up quite a bit of shelf space. The contents of the kit. This is my version of the open box review, and it'll only take you about 10 seconds to see all the pieces though, so don't waste your time trying to describe each part. Now, when we're going along, we'll be using mostly liquid cement, sometimes super glue, and usually crystal clear for canopy and glass type parts. And these are the decals. As you can see, they're very colorful, very well done. The register is great on these, and you may want to consider using some of the aftermarket setting solutions for these as well to make sure that they conform to the contours. And also, please pay attention to any of the manufacturer's safety guidelines for any of the products that you may see or hear in the review. Now, once again, you'll find that this is a very large model with lots of long seams that will need to be addressed. It also comes with some pretty large attachment points for the sprue connections there, so those will need to be cut short and then sanded off so that you get a good smooth part there without damaging them. The first thing that I decided to do was clean up the canopy, and you see here that there's a choice. You get an option of the supersonic streamlined canopy and then the subsonic with the droop nose canopy. So you make your choice with that, and then clean up all of the attachment points and dip it in some clear pledge type of wax. Let that drain off and dry. Construction will begin with the cockpit and the seats, and so glue the 2 pilot's seats together, and then we're going to mock fit that to the floor, and we found that there's a fit issue there. And the second issue here is the seam between the 2 seat halves. So in order to correct the width issue, I used a rotary tool and then a sanding disc and kind of just made it a little wider so the seat would fit in there properly. And there's a small pin in the bottom of each one that corresponds to a floor in the cockpit. And the forward set of holes, they'll be filled with rudder pedal parts. And we'll just do a little dry fit here to make sure, and then found also that seats kind of sit too high to clear the inside of the fuselage, so it makes them lean back. So I also deepened that slot where the seats go so that it would sit properly in its cockpit area. See here that the that section was widened and deepened a little bit in order to permit the seats to sit properly, and you won't be able to see that area from the cockpit window anyway. I decided to just put some tape over the seam inside there because it can't really be finished off with putty, and then we'll just paint that so that it smooths it out and doesn't look like there's a seam. So here you can see the interior now with the tape covering up that seam, and it turned out okay. I mean, once it's painted, of course that was painted a dark red, and then the ejection handles were painted yellow on the sides there. The next step was to paint the cockpit floor, the instrument panel, and the rudder pedals a light gray. And once the paint was dry, the decals for the instruments were added to the cockpit floor and the instrument panel itself. And most of this can't be easily seen, but you'll know that it's there. Once your cockpit is dried, it's time to place that. I put it in the starboard side, the right side of the fuselage, and use some slow setting glue here so that when you put the fuselage halves together, make sure that it won't lean and is perpendicular to that plane so that it looks proper. So you can grab these parts and we'll glue the intake splitters, that's parts 15 to 16, to the main engine air intake, part number 13. And as you can see, some real cleanup is needed here. There's some seams and some ejection pins. And because of the size of the model, these gaps would be very noticeable unless they're filled and smoothed out properly. When I glued the splitters onto the main intake, it leaves a nice lip there between the plate and the main intake and a big gap. So this will need to be filled and smoothed out. It needs to be flat and smooth. So use your favorite putty, clean up the lip on both sides, and the seam is just a matter of sanding and re-puttying to make sure that you get a good appearance. So get the wing sections out, and when I taped the two lower wing halves together, it was obvious the wing was going to be having some flexing and possibly cracking after being glued, because the reinforcement tabs were pretty small. So to fix that and prevent flexing of the wing, you just simply add a larger reinforcement tab made out of some plastic card or stock. And for one thing, you're going to want to make sure that the card isn't any thicker than the tabs so that it doesn't throw off the alignment for the wings and the spine. And most of the seams between the two lower wing halves will be covered when the engine intake assembly is added, so there's no real need to fill and sand those seams in this case. Once the lower wing halves are glued together, you can add the top halves. And the rear portion of the fuselage spine is part of the top wing's halves, so I chose not to clean up that seam until the mid and front sections are added, so we can do all of that together. I had decided to look at the aftermarket to see if anything was made for this kit, and in fact there was. Armory out of the Ukraine sells PE nozzle set, which I opted not to use, but I did like the looks of their wheels and tires, so I ordered a set of those, and I'll be using those as replacement for the kit's tires. So just as a note, the PE exhaust nozzle plates are still available, but I don't see the wheel and tires available on Armory's site anymore, so you may have to try and source them from an online auction. So look for the backing plates and the exhaust nozzles. Now the nozzle's cleaned up pretty easily, but there's some pin marks on the flat surface of the backing plate which are very difficult to repair, so I left those and painted that flat black to try and disguise them. But that's up to you if you want to go ahead and finish those. Now I also gave the nozzles a coat of aluminum, and then once that dried, I applied a wash of some gunmetal, thin wash on it, followed by some clear blue to give it some of that heated depth. Now on the examination, the exhaust nozzles show a little bluish color resulting from the metal being heated there, so unfortunately all of this kind of disappears when the nozzles are glued to the flat black backing plate, and that's just because of the sheen and reflectivity there. So despite the evidence, I attached the engines after the fuselage had been painted white. Since the engines took a little while, the wing assembly had glued together, it had cured, so I noticed there was a large gap between the intake and the exhaust section. And this is probably caused by some slight warping of the larger pieces over time. So it was out with some clamps. In fact, there's a large C-clamp there, as you can see, and for a gap like that you need to use a pretty strong clamp. I recommend that you use some plastic glue, either liquid or the tube glue, to keep that joint together, because over time even super glue will kind of be brittle and might let loose there. So while gluing these parts together, I noticed another small issue. The splitter plates in front don't match up with the intake exhaust body area there at the front there, and so to make it worse, when the forward landing gear cover is added, it looks even worse. And all these parts need to meet at a nice sharp point at the very front of the intake exhaust housing. So the solution for that was to simply glue a small piece of cardstock along the top of the splitter plates, butted up against the intake exhaust housing, and then just sand the plastic card shape for a point at the front, and the landing gear cover would be added later after the landing gear leg was installed. So to make use of the time here while I would be correcting those issues, I glued the forward two fuselage halves and the two mid fuselage pieces together, and once they were glued to each other, the front and mid section were then bonded, and the mid fuselage section was glued then to the wing section. So now is real fun. By cleaning up seams and gaps, and the seams along the top and bottom of the fuselage are not that bad, although some detail is lost. And there's two very difficult seams to clean up along the bottom of the mid fuselage where it joins the wing. And as you can see in this section, the seam at the mid wing point isn't too bad to get to, but as you move forward, it follows the curve along the fuselage, going under it and then over the top of the wing. And as you move forward, the distance between the two get more and more narrow. So the only solution is to take fine wet dry sandpaper and then fold it in half and get a nice edge so that you can move it along into the seam between the underside of the fuselage and the top of the forward wing section. As you see, the seam along the top of the fuselage is easy to clean up using some flexophiles and then some fine grit, sanding pads. But it's impossible to keep the fine raised panel lines from the in that outline the pilot and the co-pilot's escape hatches from being damaged. So I realized that before sanding them off, of course, and then used a pair of dividers to measure those dimensions, and I made some templates later to reinstall those outlines. And then of course we'll do that after the fuselage gets painted. Like always, filling seams is a matter of patience, but because they're so large on this, it's taking a little extra time. And so while the fit of the parts isn't really bad, there's always seams that need correcting. And sometimes it will try your patience. You just walk away for a while and then come back later and just do another section. So all told, there was probably 2 months of working on the seams off and on to make it satisfactory. So in between the seam work, I built up the outer wingtips and the hinge between the main wing and the wingtips there. And now on the actual airplane, the wingtips could be lowered to help the airflow under the aircraft and help achieve the high speeds. So Italeri gives you the option to put the parts wingtips in the upper or lowered position, and they're the same, but the two pieces making up each hinge are a little different depending on your choice there. And then the wingtips look pretty cool, and they impart the idea of speed in the lowered position, but I was unable to find photos of them down in the down position while it was on the ground. So looking at the wingtip hinge pieces here, they need some cleanup as well. And there's a small ejector pin mark on the tabs for parts 19 and 20 that are inserted into the wings, and they need to be sanded smooth, otherwise they won't slip into the wing properly. Now the same pin marks are on the hinge section of both parts, and they need to be eliminated, otherwise the parts won't go together properly. So once you clean those up and glue them together, you can set that aside to dry, and they get painted flat black. In between seams and cleanup, I was able to get to the tires and the wheels and get those taken care of. The resin parts here that replaced the kit parts were very nicely done. There was a little flash, and they're cast separately, and the wheel hubs, inner and the outers, just need to be removed from their casting blocks. Now the kit's tires come in two halves, and they have a large ridge around the middle of the tire, and all of the tires have the same ridge, so it's something that's designed in the mold. And at that scale, however, that seam turns out to be about 3 inches high and 5 inches wide. So since there weren't any on the real vehicle, I decided to you either have to sand them off and some of the tread and try and replace the tread detail, or find a set of these aftermarket resin tires. On the Armory set, the inner and outer wheel hubs are different between the front and the rear. The rear outer wheel hub has 6-sided central nut, while that of the front is circular, and so each set needs to be removed from the pour stub, and accomplished very easily with a fine-tooth saw. And I use, once separated from the casting block, each wheel hub needs to be cleaned up, and then the resin tires didn't need much, just kind of swipe them with a sanding stick. But if you use the kit's tires, and that's perfectly fine, and wheels, it's time to clean those up as well. So when I went to do a little dry fit here with the hubs and the wheels, I discovered, yep, another issue. The wheels are a little bit too large for the tire opening, and rather than try and do the outside of the wheels, I just opened up the wheel opening slightly until they fit. And of course it's time consuming, but they look great, and so I went ahead and did that and fit those parts together. And once that was done and they were cleaned up, I painted them with some steel color. The tire color is kind of unique to this aircraft. They're the same tires used on the SR-71, same type, and they're actually rubber that's impregnated with aluminum to dissipate the heat. So in order to replicate that, I took some aluminum paint, and then I added a little rubber tire black, and mixed them together until I got a look that approximated the color that I've seen on the museum examples of these vehicles. So now we'll work on the landing gear, and they're not too bad for the resin kit parts, but as I found out, they're a little hard to work with. There is a set of aluminum product from the SAC, that's a Scale Aircraft Conversions company also. But I went ahead and used these, and they come in 2 pieces for each of the rear legs. So as you can see, they need some cleanup, and there's ejector pin marks. And of course I managed to break off one of the small support arms from the main shaft, so to fix that I put a metal pin between the 2 pieces, and then adding that pin will make it a much stronger repair. So it simply involved finding a little piece of wire to use as a pin, in this case 24 gauge copper wire, and a drill bit about the same size as the wire. So just drill a hole in each piece deep enough to solidify, and seat the wire, and then cut it to length, and use some super glue to glue the wire in both pieces and both plastic pieces together, and that's a good repair. So here's a tip. While I was building and sanding seams and checking the alignment, I dropped one of the wingtips and broke off the tip, and this got repaired the same way that I had repaired the landing gear leg. Just drill some small holes and put the piece of wire in there and glue it back together and sand it and finish it. So with all of the seams cleaned up and the main part assembled together, it was time for the first coat of paint. So I used some moist bathroom tissue to mask the cockpit area, as I hadn't installed the canopy yet. And then the first coat was some classic white, just from a 3-ounce spray can. And I chose a spray can because I thought with my airbrush, even at the whitest setting, it would take a long time and might result in an uneven finish. I don't know if this has ever happened to you, but I've noticed that even when you look for them, you can't always see imperfections until you get a coat of paint on. And I found a couple of seams that needed a little bit more work, so re-putty, re-sand, and start over. So with that work behind me and the original coat of paint applied and dried, it's time to work on the canopy. And it's pretty simple set of canopy frames when it comes to masking. So I outlined the frames with thin strips of Tamiya tape and filled in the glass area with the larger pieces of tape. And it looks a little crooked in the photo, but the frames line up just correctly when they're all together. So once I was happy with the outline of the frames, I glued the canopy into place and touched up any seams, but there really weren't any there, so then touched up the paint around it. So now we're going to go revisit the issue where I had to remove some of the detail at the top of the fuselage there for the pilot and co-pilot escape hatches. And I had transferred the dimensions to a piece of paper, and in looking at the painting and decal placement guide from the instructions, I noticed that there was 2 escape hatches for the other crew directly behind those of the pilot and co-pilot. So at first I thought I'd just use some thin tape to mask and repaint the lines, but the strip of tape down the center of the fuselage would represent the distance between the starboard and port set of hatches. And I thought lining up 3 strips of tape and then pulling up the middle strip that would represent that area I wanted to paint, but no matter how much I tried, I couldn't get the 4mm wide tape to lay down in a straight line up there, so I had to think of something else. So I decided to use a first stripe of tape there as a centerline reference, and then lay down templates for each of the escape hatches, and then draw the outline of each hatch using a fine Sharpie type black pen. And after pulling up the templates, I was really happy with the result until I overcoated the lines with some clear gloss. Sharpie permanent marker black isn't black. It's actually purple, and it bled everywhere, even using acrylic gloss. Now what? So I sanded off the fuzzy purple lines, and then I decided to paint this with a flat white paint and just use a pencil, a thin 3mm pencil, a 3/10 lead pencil to trace the outline there, and it looks pretty good that way. But another issue or way you might have taken care of this was to just make some decals and just apply it over a gloss paint. So once that was done, I gave the overall model a coat of clear paint to make it all glossy once again. And once it had cured, it was time to mask off the anti-glare panel in the front of the cockpit there, and this was done easily with some Tamiya tape and an old plastic bag for the masking area. And once it was outlined, it was sprayed using some flat black. And then once the masking was removed, it looks pretty good. Just be careful to make sure that the edges of the tape are pressed down properly. So as it happened, I ran into a swap meet and found some of those landing gears from SAC, and looked them over, and they look great. So I picked those up, and they're white metal parts, and they're much stronger than the plastic parts, but they're almost an identical copy, although they fit properly, and of course there's no repairs to deal with. So I decided I'd go with those, and I just gave them a little black wash, and they look great. So as you can see in the photos, they're very nicely done, and together with the resin wheels, the realism for this particular model really gets amped up. And although of course it's going to be a little bit expensive to go to the aftermarket for these parts, the landing gear actually very much stronger, so you don't have the fragility involved there, and they're excellent looking with a little black wash on them. They look almost like the real thing. So it's up to you. Of course the kit parts will work just fine, but these will also make a nice addition to your model. As luck would have it, because of the size of this model and the joints, when I picked up the model to start putting decals in place, the fuselage crack between the forward and middle sections, right at the forwardmost part where the wing joins the fuselage. So a little more super glue into the crack, some putty, and another spray of flat white, and another coat of clear over that to repair the area. So I want to recommend that if you build this model, reinforce that fuselage joint there at that location with some plastic cardstock inside the two sections of fuselage. So it was time to build a cradle, a support cradle for the model, so that it wouldn't set or get flexed in any way. It's also something that I can use to transport the model with. And it was just a wooden base with some foam blocks placed under the forward fuselage, and a couple at the rear just wide enough to fit between the two vertical tail fins. And this way I could turn the model over and use it to attach the landing gear as well without having to sit it directly on the tail fins. So the foam blocks are high enough to keep the landing gear off the wooden base, so that during transport it just rests on the foam blocks and not on the wheels. As for decals, despite the kit's age, they settled down beautifully over the gloss coat, and the only thing was that the red lines on the vertical tail fins between the cantered wings on the forward fuselage were too long, but that's better than being too short. So once you get them in place and dried, you can just trim them away at that joint with an X-Acto knife blade, and then you can remove them with a little bit of decal setting solution, which will soften them up for removal. Use plenty of warm water and to put them into position, and some setting solutions for some of the larger ones will help it look like a painted on look over those panel lines and rivet sections. And once you're done, you're going to have something that you can be proud of. Well, there you have it. This beautiful plane is going to take a lot of work. There's no doubt about it. This is an advanced modeler's build, and there are plenty of seams to be patient and try your patience with. But if I were you, I'd go out and buy one and put it on my shelf. We hope you like this scale model step-by-step premium kit review, and so that you don't miss any more, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. But you can find us on Facebook and at our website, rightonreplicas.com. Thanks.